The house was quiet, too quiet. The silence, which usually brought relief, now felt like a heavy blanket enveloping me, holding me in place. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The lamp above the table flickered, its dim light casting long shadows on the walls, making them seem alive, as if there was something more in the house than just me. James was away again. His business trips were regular, almost like clockwork, leaving me alone in this house that seemed too big for one person. When he was here, his presence was felt only in the things he left behind: a tightly knotted tie on the back of a chair, a half-drunk glass of water on the bedside table. But when he left, the things remained, and with them, an emptiness I couldn't fill. Adam, my stepson, had lived with us for the past 2 years. He rarely left his room except for dinners, which always passed in silence. I had grown accustomed to his silence, to his intense gazes that I sometimes caught when he thought I wasn't looking. But that night, when I turned on the laptop, something changed. I remember that moment too clearly. The bedroom window was open, and the cool night air filled the room, making the curtains sway like ghosts. The wine pleasantly warmed me from within, softening the sharp edges of thoughts I tried to avoid. I scrolled through the pages of a website, my gaze lingering on headlines that made my heart race. For those seeking what cannot be named in words. Click. The text on the screen was explicit, almost shocking but not repulsive. On the contrary, it made me feel something I had long buried inside. I lost myself in this world of stories and fantasies until the creak of the door behind me made me freeze. I turned around. Adam stood in the doorway. His face was shadowed, but the light from the laptop screen illuminated his eyes, staring intently at me. I felt the blood drain from my face and my heart stopped. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. I quickly slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing in the room like a gunshot. I expected to hear his voice, laughter, or maybe judgment, but he just nodded, as if he understood something important, turned around, and left. The door closed behind him so quietly that I barely heard it. For the rest of the evening, I sat motionless, staring at the closed laptop. Inside me, 2 feelings battled: fear and a strange, terrifyingly pleasant excitement. What had he seen? What had he thought? Why hadn't he said anything? These questions haunted me all the next day. I tried to avoid him, keeping away from the kitchen, from the common living room, but when we accidentally met in the hallway, he didn't look away. "Good morning," he said in an even tone. His tone was so ordinary that I almost believed nothing had happened. But his eyes lingered on mine a little longer than they should have. There was something different in that gaze. I wanted to ask, but I couldn't. Instead, I did what I always did. I turned away. And yet, as I returned to my room, his gaze, like a tied thread, followed me, stretched until I closed the door behind me. I once heard that the loudest things in the world are those that are never said. Now I knew what that sounded like. The next morning, I went down to the kitchen, trying to act normally. The light flooded the room, turning it into a bright, almost sterile place where nothing could hide. I stood by the stove stirring the oatmeal, but my hands trembled like those of a novice liar, afraid of being exposed. Footsteps. I heard them on the stairs before I saw Adam. My heart beat faster than it should have. He entered the kitchen as calmly as always, but his gaze lingered on me again. There was something in that gaze, not judgment, not anger, something quiet, confident, as if he already knew the answer to the question I dared not ask. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, took a glass from the cabinet, and poured himself some water. "You look tired," he noted, leaning against the counter. His voice was neutral, but his tone slightly trembled, as if he was deliberately choosing each word. I looked away, focusing on the pot in front of me. "I didn't sleep well," I replied, hoping that would explain the dark circles under my eyes and the tension lurking in my posture. Is it because of yesterday? His question was simple, but it hit the mark like an arrow. I froze, the spoon hovering over the pot. Slowly, I turned to meet his gaze. Yesterday? I asked, trying to stay calm. Yes. He paused, looking at me as if trying to draw something from my reaction. You seemed upset. I didn't know what to say. His eyes, so calm and attentive, seemed to penetrate all my attempts to hide. I'm fine, I finally said, trying to sound convincing. You're probably just tired. You imagined it. He snorted, and a faint smile slid across his face. It was the kind of smile that made my heart race because it hid something more than words. Maybe, he agreed. But sometimes it seems like you're trying to hide something too. His words, calm and carefully thought out, crashed down on me like an avalanche. I couldn't move, couldn't respond. We looked at each other, and in that gaze there was more than I could bear. Adam, I began, but then fell silent because I had no words. He took a step closer, leaving the glass on the counter. You know, he said softly, you can always tell me the truth. It was unexpected. His tone, gentle, almost caring, knocked the ground out from under me. The truth? I asked, my voice slightly trembling. Yes. Whatever. What you feel. What you think. His words hung in the air, and I realized he was waiting. Not just for an answer, but for something more, some admission I couldn't afford to make. I turned away, pretending to be busy with the oatmeal, and said the first thing that came to mind. And you? Can you tell me everything too? Silence. When I turned around, he was looking at me with a smile, but there was something deep in his eyes, something inexpressible. Always, he said simply. That word, simple and honest, pierced me more than I expected. He left the kitchen, leaving me standing by the stove with a heaviness in my chest and questions I had no answers to. All day I tried to stay away from him. I retreated to the bedroom, pretending to work. My heart still couldn't slow down after our morning conversation. Each of his words, each of his gazes replayed in my head, causing an unpleasant thrill. I almost convinced myself that I could handle it if I just limited our interaction, but in the evening, he found me again. I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, trying to read a book, but the letters danced before my eyes. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I heard him enter the room, but I decided not to look up. The tea was safer. You're avoiding me. His voice sounded calm, but I felt the tension. I looked at him standing in the doorway. His dark eyes were focused, and his gaze was too intense. That's not true, I lied, trying to sound convincing. Really? He smirked, taking a step closer. Because I notice how you leave every time I'm around. You're reading too much into it, I snapped. Maybe, he shrugged, but he didn't take his eyes off me. Or maybe you're just afraid of what you think. I froze. Those words hit too close to home. You don't understand what you're talking about. I tried to close the conversation. But he took another step. His voice became softer, as if he was afraid to scare me away. Clara, I'm not going to push anything. I just want you to know that you're not alone. Those words knocked me off balance again. I don't need to hear this, I replied, but my voice sounded weaker than I wanted. He fell silent, and then he nodded, as if he had made a decision. Okay, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here. He left, leaving me sitting in the dark, looking at the cooling tea, and again his words echoed in my head. I'm here. The next day I tried to act normal. Breakfast, cleaning, a few hours editing the manuscript. It was all a theatre meant to convince me that nothing had changed, but it was a lie, and I knew it. Every step, every breath felt strained, like a string about to snap. Adam was home. I heard him moving around the kitchen, the creak of his steps on the stairs. His presence filled the air with something invisible, like electricity before a storm. I sat in my room, trying to focus on the next chapter of the manuscript, but every sentence turned into an incoherent set of words. My thoughts kept returning to him. to his words, to the way he looked at me last night. "You're not alone." The noise outside the door made me tense. I heard a soft knock and the door opened slightly. He didn't wait for an answer. "Are you busy?" he asked, peeking into the room. "Working," I answered automatically, but even I heard how fake it sounded. He came inside, leaning slightly against the doorframe. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, his arms crossed over his chest, and that relaxed look irritated me with its confident nonchalance. "You work too much. You need to rest," he noted. "I am resting," I said dryly, pointing to the laptop screen. He snorted and I felt annoyed. "Really? Because you look like you're about to explode." I wanted to wave him off, tell him to leave me alone, but instead I stopped. Why was he looking at me so intently? Why did his voice sound so gentle? "What do you want, Adam?" I finally asked, trying to hide my anxiety. He took a step closer, leaving the door open. His eyes looked straight into mine, and it was unbearable. "I just want to talk." "About what?" My voice rose slightly higher than I intended. "About you," he said, his tone unexpectedly serious. "About me?" I sighed, closing the laptop. "Adam, you've been acting strangely for the past few days. What are you trying to achieve?" "You," he said directly. My heart skipped a beat. I looked at him, unable to believe what he had just said. "What?" I finally managed to ask. "You're asking what I'm trying to achieve. It's you. I want you to be honest with me. With me, but first of all, with yourself." My hands clenched the edge of the table. His words seemed like a challenge I didn't know how to accept. "You don't understand what you're talking about," I whispered. This is wrong." He came closer. Now there was less than a meter between us. "Why is it wrong? Because that's what people say? Because it doesn't fit the rules? Who sets these rules, Clara?" "Adam, stop," I said, trying to stay calm. "You can't talk like that. You can't—" "Why?" He interrupted me, his voice low but tense. "Tell me it's wrong. Tell me you don't feel it." I wanted to answer, but the words stuck in my throat. His gaze penetrated straight through me, making me feel exposed. "You're silent," he said, taking another step. "Know why? Because you feel it too." "No," I breathed, but my voice sounded too weak. "Then tell me to stop," he said softly. "Say it, and I'll go." My breath quickened. His words hung in the air like an unbreakable promise. I stood, unable to move. His gaze, confident and unyielding, was too close. Time seemed to stop, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat. But I said nothing. He stepped back. His gaze softened, and he nodded, as if he understood my answer, even if I didn't dare to say it. "Okay," he said softly before turning around and leaving the room. When the door closed behind him, I slumped back into the chair, exhausted. My head was heavy, my thoughts jumbled. Why didn't you tell him to go? I repeated this question to myself again and again, but I had no answer. The evening was as peaceful as any other. The lazy sunlight fell on the wooden floor in the living room, and I tried to focus on the book lying on my lap. But the words were just ink stains on the page. My thoughts kept returning to the conversation with Adam. "You feel it too." Those words rang in my head as I sat motionless, staring into space. I tried to convince myself that he was wrong, that I didn't feel anything like that. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his gaze. Too confident, too close to the truth. The sound of steps on the stairs made me jump. I quickly looked away from the book, trying to appear engrossed in reading. He appeared in the doorway as if he knew exactly where to find me. In his hands he held a cup of something hot, and the aroma of coffee filled the room. "Reading?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Yes," I replied shortly, trying not to look up. "Interesting?" "Not really." He smirked and stepped closer, leaving his cup on the table next to me. I could feel him looking at me, even without glancing in his direction. "Then why are you reading?" he asked softly, almost playfully. "Because it helps to distract," I blurted out before I could think. "From what?" He sat in the chair across from me, his expression serious. I sighed and finally looked up. "Why can't you leave me alone?" He smirked, but there was tension in his smile. "Because you don't want me to." Those words hit like thunder. I didn't know what to say. He just looked at me. And I couldn't bear that gaze. "You're so sure, aren't you?" I asked, trying to sound sarcastic, but my voice trembled. "I'm sure," he replied without a hint of doubt. I put the book on the table, my fingers slightly trembling. We were back in that space where words mattered, but couldn't convey everything. The silence became heavy, almost tangible. "This is wrong," I said finally. "Why?" he asked calmly, but his eyes never left mine. "Because you think so, or because that's what everyone else is supposed to think?" "Because—" I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Tell me the truth, Clara." His voice grew softer, almost a whisper. "Do you really not want this? If you do, I'll go. But if not—" He left the sentence hanging in the air, and I felt a tense thread stretching between us. The room was too quiet, too hot. I wanted to tell him to go, but the words wouldn't come. "Adam," I whispered. That was all I could say. He took a step forward. His hand slowly reached out and he gently touched mine. I flinched but didn't pull away. His touch was light, as if he was asking, not asserting. "Do you want me to stop?" he asked. I didn't answer. Inside me, everything screamed that this was wrong, but I couldn't say those words. Instead, I let him take my hand in his. "You're not saying anything," he said softly. "No, why?" "Because you want this." His words were like a gunshot. They awakened something inside me that I had tried to bury for years. "You're wrong," I whispered, but my fingers tightened around his hand. He leaned closer and I felt his warmth, his breath. My heart was beating so loudly that I thought he could hear it. "Tell me to stop, Clara," he repeated. I closed my eyes. All I had to do was say one word, but I couldn't. Instead, I felt his lips softly touch mine, and the world I had so carefully built began to crumble. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling that the house had changed. Everything seemed the same. The light filtered through the curtains, the smell of fresh coffee wafted from the kitchen, but inside me, everything was turned upside down. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to make myself get up. What have I done? That question spun in my head like a stuck record. I tried to convince myself that I could forget it all, like a bad dream. But the truth was different. I could feel the touch of his lips, as if it were carved into my memory. When I went downstairs to the kitchen, Adam was already there. He stood by the counter, casually flipping through a magazine, but as soon as I entered, his eyes met mine. There was no hint of guilt or embarrassment on his face. He looked as confident as ever. "Good morning," he said calmly. "Good morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice from trembling. I approached the coffee maker, feeling his gaze on my back. It seemed like everything in that room knew what had happened between us. Every little thing, from the creak of the wooden floor to the sound of running water, was filled with tension. "How are you?" he suddenly asked. That question caught me off guard. I turned around, clutching the mug to my chest. "I'm okay," I replied shortly. He smirked, leaning against the counter. "Really?" "Adam," I sighed, looking at him with desperation. "We need to forget about this. What happened? It was a mistake." He straightened up, his face serious. "A mistake? Is that what you really think?" "Yes," I quickly replied, but my voice didn't sound convincing enough. He took a step closer, and my breath caught. His eyes, deep and dark, bore into mine, as if trying to decipher every emotion I was hiding. "Then why didn't you stop me?" I turned away, but he continued. "Because you didn't want to, Clara. You can lie to yourself, but not to me." "Stop," my voice rose higher than I expected. "You need to stop." "Tell me it meant nothing," he said softly but insistently. "Tell me now, and I'll disappear from your life." "But you won't say that because you know it's not true." I clenched the mug so tightly it felt like it might shatter. Words stuck in my throat. He stood so close that his warmth touched my skin. "This is wrong, Adam," I whispered, finally averting my eyes. "This will destroy us both." "Maybe," he agreed. "But sometimes what seems wrong is the only thing that makes you feel alive." Those words cut through me. He was saying what I was afraid to admit. For years I had felt empty, invisible. But with him, I felt alive. I didn't get a chance to respond when the sound of a car door closing came from outside. We both froze. "Robert," I whispered, my voice trembling. "He was supposed to be away for another 2 days," Adam said, frowning. I glanced at the window. Robert was pulling a suitcase out of the car, his usual business expression not boding well. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. "You need to go," I said, turning to Adam. "Clara." "Now," I interrupted sharply. "I can't explain this to him. Go before he comes in." He looked at me, his gaze filled with emotions I couldn't read. Then, without saying a word, he headed for the stairs, leaving me alone with that looming sense of doom. The house felt like a trap. Every sound, every step echoed in my ears. I felt like I was locked in a glass cage where everyone could see, but no one would speak. Even the air felt thick like syrup. I knew this had to end, but the fear of the inevitable paralyzed me. Robert left in the morning, as always, for work. He barely looked at me as if something inside him had already made a choice. Adam came downstairs only after Robert had left, his steps confident, but his expression tense. "We can't go on like this," I said without turning around, feeling him standing behind me. "I know," he replied softly. "This will destroy us all," I continued, my fingers tightly gripping the coffee mug. "Robert senses something. If he finds out—" I trailed off. I couldn't say it out loud. The consequences were too real. "Clara, look at me," he asked. I turned around and his gaze met mine. There was something in his eyes that tore me apart. Desire, hope, pain. "You think I want to leave?" he asked, his voice low, restrained, but the tension in it was palpable. "Do you think I don't know we've gone too far? But you can't just erase all of this." "This has to stop," I insisted, feeling my hands tremble. "We've ruined everything we could. You know that." "Maybe." He took a step closer and I felt my resolve weakening. "But I can't forget. Can you really?" I was silent. He was right again. I couldn't forget his touch, his gaze, those moments we stole from this world. But the truth was that the price for this had turned out to be too high. Later that evening, I heard the jingle of keys in the door. Robert had returned earlier than usual. I froze, standing in the living room, when he entered. His face was hard, as if he was preparing for war. In his hands, he held an envelope. "We need to talk, Clara," he said, looking at me as if I were a stranger. "Did something happen?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Something happened," he replied. "This was in the mailbox." He tossed the envelope on the table. I saw photos peeking out of it. My face turned to ice as I reached for the envelope. The pictures were of me and Adam. Blurry, grainy, but clear enough to understand what was happening. "Can you explain this?" His voice was calm, but there was a stormy silence in it. I couldn't find the words. My hands trembled, and I felt a lump rising in my throat. "Robert, I began, but the words vanished. "You slept." "With my son?" he said slowly, as if testing each word. Adam entered the room. His gaze shifted from me to Robert and back. He understood everything at once. "It's not her fault," he said firmly. Robert turned to him, his face a mask of anger. "Not her fault? Do you understand what you've done? Do you understand that this will destroy all of us?" "It wasn't just—" Adam began, but Robert interrupted him. "Enough!" His voice thundered through the room. "I don't want to hear anything. You both are traitors." I couldn't stand any longer. I sank onto the couch, clutching my head in my hands. My life, which once seemed so calm, was now in ruins. I'm filing for divorce, Robert said sharply, heading for the door. Pack your things. His words were icy. I didn't know who they were addressed to, me, Adam, or both of us. The house was empty. Robert had left, and a few days later, Adam packed his things. We didn't speak. He only paused at the door for a moment. Clara, he said softly, and I looked up. His gaze was filled with pain, but he didn't try to convince me to stay, didn't ask for forgiveness. You deserve better, he added before leaving. When the door closed, a heavy silence fell over the house. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where he had stood. Tears streamed down my cheeks, but I didn't wipe them away. All I could feel was emptiness. Weeks passed, or maybe months. I lived like a ghost, existing only to get through another day. Whispers of neighbours floated around me. People turned away when they saw me on the street. But I learned not to notice. One day I received a letter. It was from Adam. A few lines written in neat handwriting. You were everything to me, and despite everything, I will always remember how you made me feel alive. I clutched the letter in my hands, feeling the tears well up again. Maybe we had ruined everything. But in those ruins, I found a truth I couldn't ignore. Sometimes pain and passion go hand in hand, and their price is everything you ever had.